Hello, so in this video I'm going to talk about some information that I thought was super keen and really gold, and so I thought that was important to share, and so let's get started. As far as the background story, I had an English teacher back in high school that was I took a class called English for College, and the teacher had been teaching it for a while, and so we would take like um, passages and short stories, and we would have to take them apart reading by reading. And so sometimes we would do 3 to 5 readings, but each time we did it, we had to do it in a different colored pen, different colored highlighter, and we would just go through and try to take apart the story. And so eventually, after we did so many readings, and then once we got to the point where we knew the information so well and what was going on, we took it and we wrote a paper about it. And so we would take it and talk about the symbols, talk about um, the themes and everything. And so you'd use the themes and the symbols as your evidence while you're talking about certain topics that you would use inside your essay. And so each time you do a reading, you had to know what was going on. And so and then when we did our final, we took apart a film called Taking Chance, which is about a military person that tells his boss or sergeant that because there was a soldier that had been killed, and so he wanted to escort him home. And so we had to go through the film, and I think I watched the film about 5 times before the final, make sure I knew the information and I was keen on the information. And we had to take apart the film, look at the themes, look at the symbols, make sure we knew how the characters' names. So when we do the final, we didn't get to. There was an option to where we could go in the back of the classroom and look at the characters' names so we spelled them correctly, or we would get docked points. And so you had to know your information well, and you had to remember phrases inside the actual essay or inside the actual film that you wanted to use. And so that's why it was so keen. And so, especially in these passages, we had to make sure we used small glimpse phrases that we could memorize or look at easily and know what was going on through our essays if we were able to use evidence from the text or from the passages. And so, two of the actual short stories that we actually took apart was Casu Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe and The Necklace by Gay de Maupassant. I probably pronounced that wrong, I'm sorry. But the blank copy of Casu Amontillado would be something like this, where we took it apart and we had to go each by line and try to figure out what was going on through the actual short story. And so this one is very keen on where there was something that happened that there's a lot of words that you had to key on to figure out what was going on, and towards the end you figure out that they were going downstairs with a wine in hand, that he was getting closer as he went down and down and down under the floor, that he was getting closer to his death. And so at the end of the passage, it kind of shows in the text that he was getting to the point towards his death where he was going to get like chained or something on the wall because of something that Fortunato had done to someone else or to him. And so he was going to get chained to a wall and stuck there. And so after he would say, talk to from like, what are you going to do and everything. Well, then he started putting up a brick wall. And so since he was so far under the top of so far under, if he screamed, no one would hear him. And so it's really dark, but it was a good story. And so towards the end, where he was putting up the bricks, on the last brick, it showed that he put in showed how he put in a torch. Well, the torch went out because there was hardly any oxygen left in the room where he was getting stuck in underground. And so when we did it, we had to do very keen notes and know what was going on through the actual story. And so we had to go through, know exactly. And so when we did the first, second, and third readings, and sometimes fourth and fifth, we would go through with different colored pens, different colored highlighters. If we wanted to use highlighters, you would have to box the phrases, know what was going on. And then the next one was the necklace. And so this one was whether you liked or disliked which one, either of them, and then you had to pick a side on which side you would do, or that you would write your essay about. And so this one was the first one that we actually did, but I believe I did well on it, I believe, and so we would take the essay topics that we would use, and it would be like these 4 likes and then a dislike, and if we would dislikes, it would be 3 dislikes and a like, and so we had to go through and take apart very keen information that we found out. And then if we were able to use evidence, we would use like short bits, phrases, not an entire line or anything like that. And so then, one night after I had gotten home from work, I came across this video. Marty Lobdell, Study Less, Study Smart. And so the video is very informative, and so I decided to sit down and watch it, and after about like the 10-15 minutes I was locked into the video, and I wanted to know, okay, what it was, pretty good information. And so I basically just sat down and watched the rest of the video. And after I thought back to the first and the second reading and third reading that I've done, it brought some information up to my head.
I wish I had enough time to cover everything, but I don't. So I'm going to pick out kind of the most important things and make sure I get to those right off the bat.
And so he was a professor who in psychology, I recall, and so it talks about how he teaches a lot by anecdote, and he had I believe a degree in psychology. And so one of the things when he would, as a professor, he saw was a kid would come in and say, oh yeah, I studied for 6.5. The anecdote he uses was a kid came in and said he had studied for 6.5 hours, and he's like, okay, and she's like, oh yeah, I know the information, and he had asked him, well, when did you take a break? And the lady said, well, I only took a break right in the middle. And so typically when a person studies, they found that if you had a line graph, and this was like 6 o'clock when she started studying, and this was the 12, she would go for so long, and then after a certain amount of period of time, she would just get worse and worse, and then she'd get to the point where that, oh, why am I sitting here kind of moment. And so they found that he was telling students inside the actual class that he was in that if you want to try this, go home, read a book, and then once you get to the point where you're like, why am I reading this? You're not sure what you're reading about anymore. It was typically about 25 to 30 minutes that they found this. And so if you stop there, go take a 5-10 minute break, and then you come back, you're just doing constant studying, and it's effective. And so they found that when students did this constant, they would eventually study longer, and so they'd go from 35 to 45 minutes to 45 to an hour studying, and that it would be effective. And they didn't have any moments where it was, oh, why am I sitting here? Or what was I reading about? And so then they had done a survey with a couple of students, I believe at Michigan University. They took I think a few hundred students from Michigan University, and they took a couple freshmen and a couple sophomore students and said, okay, we're going to have you read this information, and then we're going to have you take a test on it, and we want you to study how you typically study. And so I think someone actually wrote down the information and found that there was like a 75% average. And then they said, okay, we're going to do a different material. We want you to study how we were talking about, how we want you to go somewhere, and then we want you to sit down and just study for 25 minutes to 30 25 to 20 to 30 minutes, and then we want you to stop, go for a 15-minute break, go somewhere, go hang out with your friends, go drive around, talk to your parents, talk to your brothers, sisters, whatever. Just don't study. And so when they came back, and then after that amount of time, they would have to come back and study more. And they found that I believe it was like a B plus average. And so then they told these students, we want you to do this on your next term of your college career. And they found that those students had a letter grade higher than what they had performed in the previous quarter. And so that's what I thought was really keen and really good information, because I didn't know that. Because I was always thought that repetition, because I usually study with repetition, and so when I heard that, I was like, wow, that's interesting. And so then he talked about to the students inside his class that asked a couple of them inside the class, okay, where do you guys typically study? And he asked them, okay, how many people studied in their bedroom? How many people studied in the living room? How many people even study in the dining room? And then asked the class finally, how many of the people in the group study in like a library or at their school in a quiet place? And a couple of hands went up on the school one, and he was actually shocked, because then he talks about how an environment is a big thing when you're studying. And so if you're sitting in your bedroom, what do you typically do in your bedroom? You go to bed. You go to sleep. And so then they asked about the living room. You're literally typically talking to family, friends, or whatever in your living room. And then the dining room, you typically are eating there. It's typically inside your kitchen. And so then they said, okay, how many of you study, and those of you that study in their library or school, how efficient is it? And he mentioned how your environment or places where you study is a very key thing on when you're studying. And so I kind of took that back and thought that was interesting. And then he mentioned for those that study in their bedroom that if you were to study in your bedroom, turn your desk to where it would be your back is to your bed, and so you're not having the temptation of, oh, I want to just go lay down for a minute and I'll come back to studying, and then you turn out just falling asleep. And so another thing that I kind of thought of, it's not technically in the video, is how like the brain works. And so typically for you to learn something, you have to see it or see it and recall it multiple times, and for it to be keen and you remember it faster. And so that's kind of where it's what I kind of thought of as I was watching the video, was you're not just going to learn one thing and just know it for the rest of ever and recall that very, very quickly. And so the professor talks about how the professors are just trying to have them learn the concept, because they're more apt to learn, if they can learn the concept, they're more apt to remember it longer. Whereas if they were trying to remember it by facts, then you can always, most times when people are looking for facts, they just go online and figure out on Google, okay, what the fact is and what's the answer to it. And so he talks about how a lot of your professors are just trying to make you learn the concept, and if you can get the concept, then you're more apt to remember it longer and know the information better. And one of the other things that he talked about in the video was, what do you typically do with the highlighter? And a couple of hands went up, and he's like, are you supposed to highlight the whole page? And I told myself no, because I was watching the video as it was going on. And he goes, well, you're only supposed to highlight short phrases inside the actual text. And so I was like, okay. And what I thought of was, if you were to read a textbook that you haven't taken a course for like, say psychology, sociology, or whatever, and you wanted to go through it, and if it's all new information, then you're more apt to highlight more than what you need for studying. And so that's where it brought me back to doing the first reading, second reading, third reading, fourth and fifth reading sometimes if you needed, the fourth and fifth if needed. And then typically in the highlighter pack, there's only 4. There's the yellow, green, blue, yellow, green, orange, and pink, and sometimes the blue if inside a 4-pack. And so it can come in a variety of combinations of the 4, but typically orange, yellow, and pink are in there for sure. And so that's kind of where it brought me back to on the readings, where if it's new information, you're more apt to just highlight the whole page because you haven't seen the information before. It's all new to you. But if you were to study it, then you're gonna have to read like 6 chapters of everything you're studying for a final. And so that's kind of where I'm getting at is if you were to do, which I'm going to start doing myself, doing the first reading, second reading, and third reading, your information for studying just gets very concise. And so when you're going to study, you don't have to go through so much information when you only need the short bits of information in that third or fourth or fifth reading that you did. And so your notes get very concise, but you're then able to recall recall information much faster.